getting right into just some of the specifications issues with the overlay panels. You can't overlay every sign you want whenever you want. So first of all, you need to look for the protruding bolt heads. A lot of our signs, some of it depends on how the sign was originally constructed. Was it an extruded aluminum sign, or which is our SPD2 standard, or is it the flat sheet sign with the Z-bars in the back? So if there's an existing bolt head, the issue there is the overlay panel won't lie flush against the surface. It'll kind of lay against the bolt heads, and you'll just be creating a little space where water and whatnot can get in there. We've also been talking about having more policy on how much of a sign you can overlay. There have been districts that have tried to overlay the entire sign, 100% of the sign, and that could potentially present some issues. So there's nothing official here, but keep in mind, when we do allow for overlays in the specifications, but it's really meant to be for just changing a message. So in the example here, it probably used to say next right, and then it got changed to a quarter mile, or maybe you would change Mechanicsville to the name of the street. But if you wanted to overlay the entire sign, that creates some additional issues that maybe need to be discussed with your district structure and bridge. Moving on to sign color. In general, that's pretty straightforward. It's just as per the MUTCD and the Virginia supplement to the MUTCD. The one thing we wanted to make sure you're aware of is when we use fluorescent colors. So I think you all know, because we've been doing it for several years, that all of our bicycle, pedestrian, and school signs are fluorescent yellow-green, and all of our construction signs are fluorescent orange. The part that is new, starting with the 2016 spec book, is that change of direction signs, so W1 series signs, are fluorescent yellow. The other thing that has changed in the specs even more recently within the past year is we've now redone the specifications, sections 247 and 701. So the big reason for that was we have now moved to type 11 sheeting. We used to be allowing type 9 or type 11. With that change, more of a housekeeping thing, but we moved a lot of the requirements for sheeting types from section 247. They're now in section 701. Yes, Boris?
I find that the head plug in MUTCD or in supplement doesn't have designations for fluorescent yellow, okay? Mm-hmm. So it will be really nice, because some head used to be from different background. Mm-hmm. It's the same name, same, okay? Mm-hmm. So it will be nice to have some different index for fluorescent, instead of write down and spec fluorescent yellow. Because if without it, contractor can pick up wrong plug and install it. Mm-hmm. Okay? So it's kind of a little deficiency in both MUTCD and supplement. Right?
Yeah, I agree, and in a very general sense, we are working on updates to the Virginia supplement to the MUTCD. So the first edition came out in 2011, after the federal MUTCD came out in 2009. We did a revision 1 in 2013. We are working on a revision 2. Originally it was going to be a 2019, now it's going to be a 2020 revision 2. And then on top of that, there's also developments at the national level with the new MUTCD that I won't get into. But I agree with you that as we revise the Virginia supplement, we can make sure that there's no conflict between the specifications. What we'll probably do is have the Virginia supplement just say sign sheeting shall be as per the spec books. That way we have the requirements in one and only one location. Because contractors, they're required to abide by the spec book, and they're required to abide by the MUTCD and the Virginia supplement to the MUTCD. But my suspicion is most contractors don't actually have a copy of the Virginia supplement out there in the field. And we have also, from purely a formatting standpoint, in the standards, in the specifications, have tried to make it clearer and easier to read as to which sign gets which type of background, both in terms of type and fluorescence or non-fluorescence. So moving on to the sign structure types, I'm going to start off small and work my way up bigger. So the smallest type is our square tube posts, which are either 2 inches or 2.5 inches. So that's the STP1 standard. That's been VDOT's primary sign support for small signs for 10, 15 years, quite a while now. What's new is the STP2 sign standard. We actually have the example right over there, so please take a look at it during the break. So it's a 4-inch square tube post for larger sign panel sizes. there are, I'll get more into the SDP2 standards in a little bit. Then we have our 5A and our 6A sign structure standards. So the 5A is a single I-beam post, and then the 6A is 2 or 3 post I-beams. We're still using the 6A a lot. There comes a point where a sign is so large, a ground-mounted sign, that there is no possible way to put it up there except for I-beam sign supports. It's not our first choice because the I-beams are expensive. There's a long lead time to order them. The foundations are quite large. Now with the 5A, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but the 5A is really not used very often anymore. Back in the day, VDOT used to use a lot of wood posts. We have since ended that practice for everything except for temporary signs. So either on work zones or if you have some sort of temporary signing situation and the sign is going to only be up for, I think it's 3 years or less, then you can still use the wood post. And then, of course, the OSS 1 standard is for our overhead sign structure. So cantilevers, full span trusses, as well as butterflies. For signpost mounting height, that is in our STP1 standard. It's actually in multiple sign structure standards, depending on the type it is. One thing that is relatively new, we only added it back in 2016, is a maximum sign height. The MUTCD talks about a minimum sign height, but there was nothing that actually precluded the contractor from doing what you see in the picture there, which is obviously a little bit ridiculous, and the driver's not going to be able to see that sign. What we suspect happened is the contractor forgot to pre-cut his posts in advance. So he had a very long length of post, got out there in the field, didn't have a saw, so he just said, oh, well, I'll just put it up like that. So that's why we've established the maximum mounting height. With the vertical clearance, another thing to keep in mind here, with both of them. So the mounting height is measured from the edge of the travelway or the top of curve. So that's all about the visibility from the point of view of the driver. The vertical clearance, what could be controlling is the far edge of the sign. So like in the example here, if it's on a cut slope, we don't want the corner of that sign being in the dirt because that could affect the breakaway properties of the sign when it is struck.
Mark, may I interrupt you and get that thing off the screen there?
Sure, yes. I will just,
Pardon me, I apologize.
I can just ignore it.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'll reset
There we
it
go.
later.
Okay,
Excuse me.
sure, no problem. All right, as far as lateral placement goes, so the near edge of the sign shall be at least 2 feet behind the edge of curb, 4 feet behind the face of the concrete barrier, or beyond the guardrail's deflection distance. So this requires you to actually know what type of guardrail is out there. So, we used to use the GR2, now we're at the MGS standard, so the guardrail deflection distance has changed. I know that when you get to a lot of roads, it is simply impractical to get the edge of sign beyond the edge of the guardrail. So what I've heard, if there's a narrow right-of-way, then that's kind of handled on a case-by-case basis, but certainly that's the preferred, is to get it beyond the guardrail's deflection distance. So these are the design tables that the standard drawings revolve around. Designers should always round up when selecting the centroid location. So if you calculate your centroid as 10.2 feet, go into this table with a centroid of 11 feet. Don't round down to 10 feet. And then when you go through the table, so you look, you know what your centroid is, you know what your area is, and I'll have an example in just a second. And based on that, you can decide how many posts you need, what type of square tube post you're going to use, so whether it's a 2-inch 14 gauge or a 2.5-inch 12 gauge or a 2.5-inch 10 gauge. And then the highest option is a 2.5-inch 10 gauge, but it has a little, an inner post down at the bottom to give it some extra strength. And then once you've decided on the size of your post and the number of posts, then you go and you figure out what type of foundation you're going to use. Don't go beyond the parameters of this table. So we're not doing, at least with the STP1, we're not doing 4-post installations. You can't do a sign post type that's not listed in there. When you get to something like this, that situation right there is probably going to be more cost effective to use either the STP2 or the 6A at this point. And part of the reason for this, it's not just the cost of the foundations and the posts itself, but one of the feedback we've heard from contractors and from the people that manage our IDSP, the Integrated Directional Signs Program, is it's relatively easy for a contractor to install a 2-post sign. When you get to a 3-post sign, and especially to a 4-post sign, it just becomes exponentially harder to get all posts lined up so that they're all exactly in a row, and they're not having to try and warp or twist the sign to bend to meet one of the posts. So we have foundation types. They're lettered A through F for the SDP1. The designer is to determine the type based on the option selected. Now, in some cases, there might be more than one option, so then it becomes a district preference, and really the district maintenance people's preference. What's going to be easiest for them to maintain in the field? And then, if it's some signs you can do it with or without a slip base, so they might prefer the slip base because if the sign gets hit, it'll just be that much easier to quickly repair out in the field. We also, we used to require Class A3 concrete, which is the same type of concrete used for bridges, for posts. We've now gone to a pre-approved bag mix, so that makes it a little bit easier for the contractor out in the field. He just pours the bag in a wheelbarrow, mixes up with some water, and then pours it in. Okay, so the Type C foundation, that's a direct-driven one. And then the Type D, E, and F foundations, they allow for cementitious material, which we've interpreted as meaning just any bag of cement, like you can buy at your local Home Depot. And then we have an option for a soil plate, but it's not always going to be ideal for all locations. One thing I will also add that has just come up recently on a project is, it's not most of the time when VDOT is installing signs, especially because we're not usually in cities, but occasionally you do have to install a sign in an existing sidewalk or maybe attaching it to an existing concrete median. Talk to us. There are options that are not in the standards, but there are options for bolting it directly to the concrete so you don't have to have the contractor drilling into the existing concrete. With the charts in the state. So most of the state is Table 2. If you are in Hampton Roads District, then if you're in this orange or pink area, I guess it looks on your screen, that would be Table 1. It's the highest wind zone. If you're in the blue area, so Sussex, Southampton, and Greensville counties, and also I think the city of Emporia, then that's the rest of the state. That applies, you're in Table 2. So the first thing you need to know is what is your centroid? So this is kind of middle school, high school math, maybe ninth grade math here, to kind of figure out the centroid if you've got multiple signs on the same post. So and we actually have something in the standard drawings that shows how to do this, but it's basically a weighted average is all it is. So you do the weighted average and figure out your centroid. Then step 2 is you decide which table you're going to be in based on your geography. And then you determine the post size and the foundation type. So the centroid, and I'll still go through the example in a little bit. So in this case, with a centroid of 10, we might find that the area is more than 8.5 square feet, but less than 17 square feet. So you can do the sign on 2 posts, but you can't do the sign on 1 post. And as with earlier, just with the centroid, you round up, you don't round down. So if your area is 8.6 square feet, you're putting it on 2 posts, not on 1 post. Okay, so here's an example. So first you need to figure out the centroid. So in order to figure out the centroid, you need to know what's the mounting heights. That's 7 feet. But of course, the ground is almost never exactly level with the ground. So in this case, it's probably about a 1.5 foot drop off, which is fairly shallow. But a lot of times in steep cut or fill slopes, it might be a lot more than 1.5 feet from the road edge down to where the actual post is going to be. And then this is a 4x4 warning sign. So 48 inches by 48 inches. But the distance to the centroid, from the bottom of the sign to the centroid of the sign, is not 24 inches because it's a diamond-shaped sign. So you got to break out your middle school geometry. And in this case, it works out to 2 foot 10 inches. So if you add that all up, 2 foot 10 inches plus 7 foot plus 1.5 feet, you get to 11 foot 3 inches, which you then round up to 12 feet. So you go in here to 12 feet, and it was a 16 square foot sign. So therefore, you can support this on a single post with using a 2.5 inch 10 gauge post. And this is in the rest of the state, not in Hampton Roads. And if you go all the way to the right, you need a Type B or a Type C foundation. Next thing is we have a new standard, the ISD-1 standard, which only came out within the past year. Before that, it was part of the Square 2 Post standards, and we made it its own standard because this is really something that applies irrespective of what type of post you are using. Although in practice, I think most do not enter and wrong way signs are on an STP1. So this deals with the height of the sign. Most of the time, the mounting height is fairly typical. It's 7 feet in a lot of cases. Sometimes you're allowed to go down to 5 feet. But if you are at an off-ramp and you have the do not enter or the wrong way sign, that needs to be 3 feet off the ground. And the reason you do that is to help deter wrong way drivers. A lot of wrong way drivers are drunk. So they're driving down the cross street at 3 a.m., the bar just let out, and they are contemplating a one-way left turn onto the off-ramp, a wrong way left turn. Well, their gaze tends to be pointed low to the ground. All of us have our gaze pointed low to the ground when we're making a left turn, but for drunk drivers, it's even lower. So by lowering this, it seems like it does a good job of catching people's attention more than if it's at a higher mounting height. So that's why we do it. I do strongly recommend that designers specifically call this out on the plans because this is an unusual thing. I think a lot of sign contractors are so used to a 7-foot mounting height that they don't think about the fact that this is a unique location where it needs to be much lower to the ground. So having something on the plans would really help to make sure it gets installed the way it's supposed to. So moving on to the STP2, the 4-inch square T-post. The placement details are very similar to those for an STP1. Just like an STP1, this can go on a 1-post, 2-post, or 3-post. However, this one we actually allow for a 4-post or a 5-post installation. It can accommodate a lot larger signs compared to an STP1. There is no, so it depends on the centroid number of posts. We also have a much bigger maximum sign area, so we can go up to 200 square feet on an STP2. We can go up to an 18-foot centroid on an STP2 as well. The other unique thing about it that's not on the slide is STP2 is a MASH tested standard. And for those of you who don't know MASH, you probably all know what it is, but it's the Manual of Assessing Safety Hardware is what I believe it is. So the feds have said that they want all, as of contracts advertised after December 31st, 2019, as in 1.5 months from now, that all signposts need to be tested to MASH. There used to be the NCHRP 350. Now we've gone to MASH. There's a lot of issues with that, and when it comes to the smaller square T-posts, there is no MASH tested standard. But with the specific to the 4-inch square T-post, that has been MASH tested. So the foundation, it's somewhat similar to the foundation used for 6A foundation. So in the standards, we do have the size of it. It's quite a bit bigger foundation than the STP1. Although maybe not quite as big as the 6A foundation. And then specific to gore signs, that's a unique location because gore signs are uniquely susceptible to being struck. It really is probably preferable to put it on a single 4-inch square T-post as opposed to 2 or 3 of the STP1 posts. So if it is hit, it's just that much easier to quickly get up and get a replacement. The mounting height is similar to the STP1. We also have lateral placement requirements, which is actually similar to what we do for the 5A and the 6As. And just like with the STP1, we do want to get it behind the guardrail's deflection distance if there is guardrail there. Okay, moving on to the I-beam standards. As I said, we're not using those as often, but we are still using them. If you do calculate when you're doing your quantities, make sure you include the stub post length. So the stub post is shown here is 2 foot 9 inches. So that is included in the quantity of length calculations. So there have been some confusion in the field. Some designers were thinking one thing, but then the contractor was thinking something else, and the inspectors, there was a lot of confusion. So we just tried to make it more explicitly clear. It is when you put your post lengths in the plans, that is your best estimate of quantity, but it is the contractor's length to verify that based on finish grade when he's installing it in the field and to cut his I-beams in advance so that it's the right length when he gets out there in the field. That's the contractor's responsibility. So here is an example. So this is in Central Region. So we are in Table 2. I'm sorry. There is no Table 2 or Table 1 for the 5A and the 6A. There is no Table 2 or Table 1. However, there is for the STP2. I was thrown off because we went from STP2 to the 5A, 6A, back to the STP2. But anyway, So you need to determine the following. First, you need to determine the post size, which you already know because it's 4-inch. Then you need to determine the foundation type. So we'll go through this. So in this case, we've got a mounting height of 8 feet. We got the centroid of 9 feet. So when you go through this, you need the 4-inch 8-gauge post. You need the Type C foundation. And then you can also go through, and the contractor, there's instructions for him for calculating the bracing. Yes?
Can you go 2 slides, 3 slides back?
1, 2, 3. Here?
No, one more.
Here?
Yeah, maximum is 30 feet. Where it came from? Maximum height.
That's something that's been in our 6A standards for quite a while. I don't know that it's ever been used, but I think you could have locations with very wide right-of-way where we just don't want the sign so far off to the side that it's actually not even really viewable by the driver
It's
anymore.
legal, please. I apologize. I thought it's the maximum height.
No.
Because wind factor kick, I believe, last time I checked, it was years ago, structural specs, it's 18 feet. So used to be some notes in the maximum allowable heights of signs of base of this chart. It's because if you go too far, too tall, that could be a problem. Because
Right,
completely
yeah.
different winds.
Yeah, well, that's if the contractor installs it at a higher mounting height than the minimum, then he's installing it at a different centroid. So that would also, at a certain point, the centroid's so high that you're outside the allowable requirements in these
Not
standards.
centroid, centroid is simple geometry, but wind will be completely different. I apologize, I thought it's a height, it's late.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so this is a good flowchart rule of thumb that we've developed to help you figure out what type of signpost should I use. So if you can use an STP1, and this is assuming it's for a permanent sign and not for a work zone sign, use an STP1. There's no reason not to. It's the smallest, it's the least expensive, smallest foundations, easiest for the contractor to handle without a lot of complicated equipment. If you then get up to a larger size, you're going to have a choice where you could do it on either 3 STP1 posts or 1 STP2 post. There, it's a bit of a case-by-case preference and case-by-case basis and district preference. I mentioned before the Gore area. That's probably an example of where you would really be preferable to put it on a single STP2 post because it's so uniquely susceptible to being struck. And I am curious during the Q&A when we're done with this to see from the districts here what they think in these types of scenarios. What would you do? So moving on, let's say you can't do 3 STP1 posts or 1 STP post. It's too big for that. The next question is, can you put it on the STP2 standard, the 4-inch square 2 post? If you can, then probably the answer is yes, use the STP2 post. It's going to be preferable to the 5A post. I had mentioned before how the I-beams are expensive. There's a long lead time to procure them. It's kind of complicated for the contractors to install. The foundations are deep. I am curious to hear, we've kind of heard that at this point no one's really using the 5A standard anymore. One option that is under consideration within central office is to simply get rid of that standard entirely. The only other time when the 5A standard is used is for flashing beacons. But at this point, we have the FB2 standard that still shows the flashing beacon as being installed on the 5A post, but that's on our to-do list of things to modify because it's probably preferable to put it on a round pedestal type pole instead, rather than an I-beam support. So the last step is if you can't put it on 2 or 3 STP2 posts, it's getting even larger. Now you're come to a choice where you can either put it on STP2 posts, but you'll need 4 or 5 posts, or you can put it on a 6A post, but then you would need either 2 or 3 of the 6A posts. There again, you just need to look at the costs, compare the costs, and also talk to your district about their preference. I mentioned before about the constructability issues with 4-post and 5-post installations. So some districts may prefer to use the STP2 in this type of circumstance. And then the last step in the flow chart, when the sign gets large enough, you have absolutely no option but to put it on 6A posts. So that's what you need to do. As far as temporary signs, we do allow wood, like I mentioned before. The wood post standards are similar to the STP1 standards, but there are some differences. there's only one statewide design table, so it doesn't matter where in the state you are. We do allow, I will also add, the WSP1 standard is a little, the name is a little confusing. It actually allows for temporary use of square tube posts. So if a contractor can choose to use either a wood post or a square tube post for his temporary sign. If he uses square tube posts, we do allow the square tube posts to be spliced, and we allow the post to extend up to 2 feet above the edge of the sign. We don't allow that for permanent signs because of aesthetic reasons, but we're willing to live with that for our temporary signs. And then the contractor determines the foundation type. Moving on to overhead sign structures. One policy change that is new for this year is our new sign lighting policy, 380.1, came out in May of 2019. Before that, 380.0 used to walk through warranting criteria for sign lighting, and instead of sign lighting, if it didn't meet the warranting criteria, then it would say sign lighting is not necessary. We've now strengthened that. We say sign lighting shall not be provided except where warranted. And the reason we did that is a couple reasons. One is, as we've moved to Type 9 and out to Type 11 for our overhead signs, the sheeting's got a lot better. There was new research, an NCHRP research report that came out in 2016 or so, 2017, that wasn't available at the time when the original version of this INIM was developed. And also just in conversations with executive leadership at VDOT and even members of the CTB who've grown very concerned about impacts of lighting on light pollution and light trespass, not to mention just the operational impacts to VDOT, both in terms of electric bills and the cost to maintain these lights. So that's why we've gone in this direction. We also, because of this, we've also ended the practice of designing sign structures to support future addition of sign lighting. We used to say that if you had sign lighting, you put a 17-foot 6-inch clearance to the bottom of the sign lights, and if you didn't have sign lighting, then you had to put the bottom of the sign 19.5 feet up so that you could add sign lighting in the future. We've now decided that the chances of that ever happening are so astronomically remote that it's not worth the extra cost to the structure to build it 2 feet higher. So now we just allow, if you're not putting in sign lighting, you're just putting in 17-foot 6 inches to the bottom of the sign. We have also moved to LEDs for all sign lighting luminaires, just like we have for road lighting, so there is no more high pressure sodium. Also, the luminaire retrieval system, we've separated that out as a separate pay item, and the luminaires themselves are now a separate pay item. And because the LEDs are so much more longer lasting, we're saying if you do put up sign lighting, you don't necessarily have to put up the luminaire retrieval system. That's just a case-by-case basis. Those things are really expensive. It's surprising, and I think it was kind of a hidden cost because up until very recently, it was just rolled into the cost of the overall structure. So when you lump in the concrete, the steel, and all the attachment hardware and everything else in with the sign lighting, it's difficult for designers and for everyone else in VDOT to understand how much the sign lighting by itself cost. Well, we had a project in Richmond District where it was broken out as a separate cost, and some of the luminaire retrieval systems on the very wide truss sign structures were, over $100,000 for those luminaire retrieval systems. So, as a part of this new policy, whenever you don't have to go out and evaluate all your sign lighting tomorrow for those of you districts that still have sign lighting, but when an existing sign panel is replaced, so an older Type 3 sheeting sign is being going through a life cycle replacement and brought up to Type 11 sheeting, then the existing sign lighting shall be evaluated for potential decommissioning. So decommissioning just means cutting power to the lights. There could be circumstances where we just leave the lights up, they're just no longer working. And we've had districts that have done that before, and we've never gotten any citizen complaints. So how do you decide whether or not sign lighting is warranted? It's based on a visual complexity rating. This is a qualitative 1 through 5 rating. So basically, the more complex the visual environment, the harder it is to pick out the sign in the sea of everything else that's going on. So when you get to very high visual complexity rating, there comes a point when you still need the sign lighting to draw the driver's attention to the sign. So this photo is an example of one. There's nothing but woods out here. There's no road lighting. The driver's attention is naturally focused on the sign because there's nothing else competing for his attention. Whereas when you get into downtown Richmond and you've got billboards and car dealerships and the city street lightscape and everything else going on and all the opposing headlights because it's a narrow median, that's a much higher visual complexity rating. And we do have some examples of 1 through 5 in there, but it is going to be, because it's a qualitative ranking, there is room for disagreement between engineers about whether something is a 2 or a 3. It also depends on something that's new in the INIM. We used to just have a single warranting criteria regardless of whether the sign was on the highway or off the highway. Most of our guide signs are on the limited access highway, but we do have guide signs that are on the crossroad approaching the interchange. So it's a little bit different criteria. Depends on the type of sign sheeting. So particularly if you're thinking about existing signs with older sign shading, there's a little bit different criteria versus brand new signs. And lastly, the unencumbered site distance. So there are the tables in the INIM, you go through all that and you figure out whether sign lighting is warranted or not warranted. There's also a unique exception for Afton Mountain and Fancy Gap Mountain areas because of all the fog. And you probably all saw on the news today there was a pretty bad crash in Afton Mountain just yesterday. Last thing is this sign removal supplemental specification. I think many of you designers have used this plan sheet before that kind of lists out the pay items actually on the plan sheet itself. Please don't use this anymore. This is no longer applicable. We also used to have a very complicated scheme of figuring out what type of sign you're removing. We've now kind of really simplified those specs for that. So we have new standard pay items for whether you're removing an existing sign structure, you're removing an existing sign panel, or you're relocating an existing sign panel. We also used to have standard pay items for removing and salvaging versus remove and disposable. But in practice, it is very rare, if ever, where VDOT is removing and salvaging a sign. If we're paying the contractor to remove it, let him figure out what to do with it. Some other sign items. Breakaway support systems shall not be used for poles that support electrical power service equipment. So we don't want, if you have a flashing beacon, we don't want the actual flasher assembly controller actually on the breakaway sign support itself. We've also revised details for temporary signs. And then we changed, we made some minor changes to the SPD1 standard, which we used to say there was like a maximum distance between those vertical splices. Now it's just a minimum splice distance. Figure on the assumption that if the contractor can, the sign fabricator can build it wider than that, why would we stop them from doing it? Obviously, the fewer vertical splices, the better. And it's not on here, but I should also add that we changed the SPD2 standards, the extruded aluminum standards. So we're now doing through bolting for the top and bottom row when it is attached to an overhead sign structure. So we've strengthened the method of attachment for when an extruded aluminum is attached to an overhead sign. I also wanted to add, I have seen a couple of districts that have inserted in plan notes prohibiting the contractor from using extruded aluminum. I'm not sure why. There seems to be a mistaken impression out there that it is impossible to overlay an extruded aluminum sign. You can very easily overlay an extruded aluminum sign, and a lot of contractors will prefer it. It's just easier for them to handle and install up there in the field. So please let the contractor choose. We have no reason not to let the contractor choose. So with that, I will take questions. So the question, let me just repeat it in case the camera didn't hear it, was whether or not the bag mix concrete, because it's not as strong as the Class A3 concrete, and moreover, some contractors are lazy about not mixing it properly. So the question is the concern is whether or not the ready mix concrete can really truly serve as an A3 replacement. And I see Harry raising his hand over there, so I'm going to let him answer that.
So one of the challenges with this is we found a bag mix off the pre-approved list that meets the freeze-thaw test. Not what you could go buy at the home improvement store. This is something you got to commercially order. It's the same concrete you'd use to pour a patch on a concrete pavement, and it has, I believe, somewhere around an ultimate of 6,000. So it does have to be mixed right, and it has to be mixed quick because it gets very hot quick. So you really need a hand mixer. But for the IDSP, for those of you who are familiar with the integrated directional sign program, that contractor has the hand mixer on site, and can mix it fast, and it's a lot faster than waiting on a truck with A3 concrete. So the other aspect of this is, of course, the reinforcing is in it. So it actually far exceeds the A3 spec, but it's got to be mixed correctly.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, well, great. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then Chris Daly is going to do the pavement markings module.